Hey everyone, I'm not a team of people, I'm just one person. If you want to support the work I do, there's 3 things you can do. Number 1, please subscribe for more videos like this. Number 2, join the Patreon. You can access the amazing Discord server there, and there's all kinds of exclusive content that's not on YouTube. Number 3, you can donate, whatever you can afford. And I just want to thank everyone that has already subscribed, become a patron, and donated. Love you all, thank you. In the spring of 1948, a group of 8 men sat together to discuss a move that would massively impact the future of the Middle East forever. Ostensibly a debate of sorts, the question hanging in the air, with time running out to decide, was whether to recognize a new Jewish state in Palestine. On the opposing ends were the State Department, led at that time by the towering figure of General George C. Marshall, the other end being represented by the White House. President Harry S. Truman had asked a domestic advisor, Clark Clifford, to deliver the case for recognition. As Clifford would later write in his memoir, "Of all the meetings I ever had with presidents, this one remains the most vivid. Not only did it pit me against a legendary war hero whom President Truman revered, but it did so over an issue of fundamental and enduring national security importance: Israel and the Mideast." The president regarded his Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, as the greatest living American. Yet the 2 men were on a collision course over Mideast policy which, if not resolved, threatened to split and wreck the administration. Marshall firmly opposed American recognition of the new Jewish state. I did not. Marshall's opposition was shared by almost every member of the brilliant and now legendary group of men later referred to as the Wise Men. It included the respected Undersecretary of State Robert Lovett, his predecessor Dean Acheson, the brilliant Chief of the Policy Planning Staff George F. Kennan, the dynamic and driven Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, and a man with whom I would disagree again 20 years later when we served together in the cabinet, Dean Rusk, then the director of the Office of United Nations Affairs. Though Truman had tapped Clifford to be the messenger of his opinion, Clifford saw the president changing his mind, and he worked steadfastly to keep the administration on its course. My fears about the State Department had crystallized after a bitter incident in March when, without informing the president, it had permitted the American delegation to the UN to reverse its support for partition. Partition as in the November 1947 partition plan which immediately preceded the 1948 war and ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Truman was outraged by the State Department's move, writing in his calendar, "The State Department pulled the rug from under me today. There are people on the 3rd and 4th level of the State Department who have always wanted to cut my throat. They succeeded in doing it." Clifford continues in his memoir that, despite his annoyance, though, the president did not order the State Department to re-endorse partition, lest he create a crisis with Marshall. And as Clifford prepared for his fateful meeting, he noticed that the president may very well have sided with Marshall. Marshall and Lovett had prepared a position paper for the president's consideration. Reading it before the meeting, I saw it amounted to a clever way to avoid recognizing the new nation, and I feared that the president's respect for Marshall might prevail. And then came the spirited debate, which would go down as legendary. At 4 p.m. on Wednesday, May 12th, a cloudless, sweltering day, we assembled in the Oval Office. "Mr. President," I said, "I strongly urge you to give prompt recognition to the Jewish state immediately after the termination of the British Mandate on May 14th. This would have the distinct value of restoring the president's firm position in support of the partition of Palestine. Such a move should be taken quickly, before the Soviet Union or any other nation recognizes the Jewish state." I knew my comment would displease Marshall and Lovett. I had noticed Marshall's face reddening with suppressed anger as I talked. When I finished, he exploded. "Mr. President, I thought this meeting was called to consider an important and complicated problem in foreign policy. I don't even know why Clifford is here. He is a domestic advisor, and this is a foreign policy matter. I fear the only reason Clifford is here is that he is pressing a political consideration with regard to this issue. I don't think politics should play any part in this." The situation became ugly when, Clifford writes, Marshall spoke again. he was still furious. Speaking with barely contained rage and more than a hint of self-righteousness, he made the most remarkable threat I have ever heard anyone make directly to a president. If you follow Clifford's advice, and if I were to vote in the election, I would vote against you. Everyone in the room was stunned. Here was the indispensable symbol of continuity whom President Truman revered and needed, making a threat that, if it became public, could virtually seal the dissolution of the Truman administration. Marshall must have taken the president's decision deeply personally, as Clifford wrote, "Not only did he never speak to me again after that meeting, but, according to his official biographer, he never again mentioned my name." Then, at the end of that day, still steaming, he did something quite unusual, although the president and I were unaware of it at the time. Certain that history would prove him right, he wanted his personal comments included in the official State Department record of the meeting. Those comments are immortalized in the Foreign Relations of the United States History series. A top-secret memorandum of conversation by the Secretary of State from the day of the quarrel provides George C. Marshall's side of the story. The president said that he had called the meeting because he was seriously concerned as to what might happen in Palestine after May 15th. The president then invited Mr. Clark Clifford to make a statement. Mr. Clifford's point was strongly to urge the president to give prompt recognition to the Jewish state after the termination of the mandate on May 15th. I remarked to the president that, speaking objectively, I could not help but think that the suggestions made by Mr. Clifford were wrong. I thought that to adopt these suggestions would have precisely the opposite effect from that intended by Mr. Clifford. The transparent dodge to win a few votes would not in fact achieve this purpose. The great dignity of the office of the president would be seriously diminished. The counsel offered by Mr. Clifford was based on domestic political considerations, while the problem which confronted us was international. I said bluntly that if the president were to follow Mr. Clifford's advice, and if in the elections I were to vote, I would vote against the president. Why was Marshall so fervently against recognition? Answers may lie in the fact that Marshall represented not only the State Department position, but also the leadership of the U.S. military. Careful attention was given to their positions by the late Mark Perry, who was a senior analyst at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Perry would write for Foreign Affairs in 2010 that, in the period between the end of World War II and Marshall's meeting with Truman, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had issued no less than 16 papers on the Palestine issue. The most important of these was issued on March 31, 1948, and entitled Force Requirements for Palestine. In that paper, the JCS predicted that the Zionist strategy will seek to involve the United States in a continuously widening and deepening series of operations intended to secure maximum Jewish objectives. The JCS speculated that these objectives included initial Jewish sovereignty over a portion of Palestine, acceptance by the great powers of the right to unlimited immigration, the extension of Jewish sovereignty over all of Palestine, and the expansion of Eretz Israel into Transjordan and into portions of Lebanon and Syria. One paragraph of Clark Clifford's account, perhaps more than any other, aptly summarizes the rift that would grow between the State Department and its foes in the White House and beyond. Read carefully, it contains a powerful narrative of the influence of the side that prevailed. I was also in close contact, directly and through David Niles, with Eliyahu Epstein, the Jewish agency representative in Washington. Through Epstein, I had been able to learn much about the situation in the Mideast, in particular the position of the Jewish agency, information that went beyond what the State Department, with its pro-Arab bias, allowed to filter across the street to the White House through official channels. Years of shrewd political maneuvering preceded the momentous decision by the White House to recognize the Jewish state. Walter L. Hickson, in his extremely detailed Israel's Armor, the Israel Lobby, and the First Generation of the Palestine Conflict, documents the earliest beginnings of the men who had Clark Clifford's ear. The pivotal moment crystallizing the American special relationship with Zionism came in May 1942, with the historic meeting at the Biltmore Hotel in New York City, attended by 586 American Zionists. The meeting culminated with passage of a resolution known as the Biltmore Program, that centered on the pledge that Palestine be constituted as a Jewish commonwealth, and also called for unrestricted Jewish immigration. Though somewhat obscure in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, its significance cannot be overstated as, in Hickson's words, the Biltmore meeting marked the birth of the Israel lobby. I've described the legacy of Isaiah Cy Kennan in another video of mine, though his name being synonymous with the earliest years of the Israel lobby is beyond dispute. And as early as 1944, their stranglehold on Congress was already evident. As described by Hickson, the signature strategy of the Israel lobby, lining up support for the Zionist state in the U.S. Congress, first materialized in the 1944 electoral campaign. Kennan kept diligent records of his political actions, writing in February of that year, "The unprecedented flood of telegrams, telephone calls, and letters profoundly impressed the Capitol, evoking many assurances of support from congressmen." This was early enough that the principal lobby group at the time was the American Zionist Emergency Council, and the AZEC had achieved an endorsement from both the Republican and Democratic parties. More important for them was the platform endorsed by Franklin D. Roosevelt's Democratic Party, which read, "We favor the opening of Palestine to unrestricted Jewish immigration and colonization." August 1945, President Harry Truman told the press, "We want to let as many Jews into Palestine as is possible." Truman's sympathies with the Jews was described by his close advisor Clark Clifford. He was, of course, horrified by the Holocaust, and he denounced it vehemently, as in the aftermath of the war its full dimensions became clear. Also, he believed that the Balfour Declaration committed Great Britain, and by implication the United States, to the creation of the Jewish state in Palestine. And finally, he was a student and believer in the Bible. From his reading of the Old Testament, he felt the Jews derived a legitimate historical right to Palestine, and he sometimes cited such biblical lines as Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 8. Behind the scenes, however, clear references were made to another factor in the president's decision-making. From a memorandum by Undersecretary of State Will Clayton in September of 1946, Zionists are urging that you should issue at once a statement in favor of partition in Palestine. Upon consideration of this matter, we do not feel that it would be advisable for you to issue such a statement at this time for the following reasons, including, if we yield to the pressure of highly organized Zionist groups just now and make statements calculated to give support to their policies of the moment, we shall merely be encouraging them to make fresh demands and to apply pressure in the future whenever they conceive it to be in their interest. Any statement by this government approving partition would mean that we had gone contrary to the recommendations both of the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry and of the experts who drew up the Morrison-Grady scheme. This would undoubtedly give rise to the impression that we are adopting a policy on an important matter in order to satisfy a particular Zionist group. And finally, the attitude of the Arab world toward the United States has become progressively hostile in the last few months. Our Joint Chiefs of Staff, who feel that the United States has a vital security interest in the Middle East, have urged that we take no action with regard to Palestine, which might orient the peoples of the entire area away from the Western powers. A 1968 oral history interview with Truman White House Appointment Secretary Matthew J. Connolly also blows the lid open on these political pressures. The interviewer asked him, "On the subject of the recognition of Israel, how instrumental was Clark Clifford, in your opinion, in formulating the events of that time, in convincing Mr. Truman that the State of Israel should be recognized as quickly as it was?" Connolly responds, "Well, the decision had already been made with the assistance of David K. Niles, who handled the minority problems, and myself. We were the fundamental movers." The interviewer asked subsequently, "Why did you take the position that you did?" Connolly responds, "For two reasons. One, it was humanitarian, and two, it was good politics. And I raised the question with Mr. Truman, how many Arab votes are there in the United States? Where does the Democratic Party get its financing from?" And the answer was apparent. The name David Niles is ubiquitous in this early history, and when asked about him specifically, Connolly declares, "David Niles was a very bright political analyst. He was quiet. He was receptive. He was never out in front. During the Roosevelt administration, they used to call him the backstairs boy at the White House." With regard to the 1948 election, the interviewer asked the golden question: how important, in your opinion, was the recognition of the State of Israel early in 1948 to the Democratic victory the following November? Connolly admits, there's no question about it. He had practically a solid Jewish vote. He also had financial contributions to the campaign in 1948 that he never would have had without Jewish support. It was a matter of, more or less, just pure politics to me. Perhaps Truman truly sympathized with the plight of the Jews, who just years earlier had suffered at the hands of the Nazis, and perhaps his fundamentalist upbringing helped shape his thinking with regard to Middle East policy. However, it would not be telling the whole story to omit the other considerations that he wrote about, for example, in his memoirs. The facts were that not only were there pressure movements around the United Nations unlike anything that had been seen before, but that the White House, too, was subjected to a constant barrage. I do not think I ever had as much pressure and propaganda aimed at the White House as I had in this instance. The persistence of a few of the extreme Zionist leaders, actuated by political motives and engaging in political threats, disturbed and annoyed me. Some were even suggesting that we pressure sovereign nations into favorable votes in the General Assembly. The 1948 war in Palestine had created an incalculable human tragedy. The Zionist forces' Plan D, or Dalit in Hebrew, implemented by the spring of 1948, had systematically condemned hundreds of villages, in the end more than 500, for destruction. As Israeli historian Benny Morris would describe in his The Birth of the Palestine Refugee Problem, the essence of the plan was the clearing of hostile and potentially hostile forces. However, the Haganah regarded almost all the villages as actively or potentially hostile. History tells us that the Zionists had long schemed to use any partition plan to their advantage, beginning a takeover of the entire land of Palestine. David Ben-Gurion made as much known in his statement regarding the 1937 Peel Commission Plan. Under this proposed partition, the Jews would receive some 20% of the land, absent 200,000 Palestinians who were to be removed from it, the rest becoming not a Palestinian state, but simply an extension of Jordan. The ultimate goal would be achieved most quickly by accepting the Peel proposals, Ben-Gurion told the 20th Zionist Congress. Erect a Jewish state at once, even if it is not in the whole of the land. The rest will come in the course of time. It must come. The boundaries of Zionist aspirations are the concern of the Jewish people, and no external factor will be able to limit them. By way of Plan Dalit, some 750,000 Palestinians were made homeless, forced to march toward Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza. Mines would be laid in their old neighborhoods to kill those wishing to return. Otherwise, they'd simply be shot on sight. Indeed, Israel authorized a free-fire policy in which, again referencing Benny Morris, soldiers, policemen, and security guards, especially at night, fired at anything that moved. The evidence suggests that the vast majority of those killed were unarmed. The overwhelming majority had infiltrated for economic or social reasons. The Zionists overwhelmed all the armies of the surrounding Arab states and formed a secret pact with Jordan to avoid fighting their formidable Arab Legion. By the time of the armistice talks of 1949, the new state of Israel had found itself in a comfortable position at the negotiating table. As described by Mark F. Etheridge, chairman of the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine, the Arabs are shocked and stupefied by their defeat and have great bitterness toward the UN and the United States. The Arabs have made what the Commission considers very great concessions. The Jews have made none so far. It was this Zionist intransigence that would provide the basis for the first animosities between the White House and the Jewish state. Indeed, the history of the so-called special relationship has been fraught from the beginning. Michael Hoffman followed the talks in Lausanne, Switzerland for the New York Times. On April 28, 1949, he reported, following the initial talks, Mark Etheridge, United States chairman of the commission, said he was confident a peace settlement could be reached. At a press conference, Mr. Etheridge indicated that, in the commission's view, settlement of the Arab refugee problem was the key to the whole Palestine solution. The only problem with that being, Hoffman reported the following day, unless Israel modifies her attitude on the refugees, she is due for some sharp setbacks in her struggle for stability and world recognition. It seems to some observers that for the first time, Israel is on the wrong side of almost every point at issue in the eyes of world opinion, as expressed through the United Nations resolutions on Palestine. These observers reason as follows. Israel is occupying territory that has been repeatedly assigned to the Arabs in various partition plans. Israel is acting as if Jerusalem were to be incorporated fully into the new state. Israel is encouraging further immigration of Jewish settlers while rejecting responsibility for the reestablishment of 600,000 to 1 million Palestinian Arabs displaced from their former homes. These are the factors cited in commission circles as reasons why Israel's position has weakened. Of these factors, the refugee problem is by far the most important. As Walter L. Hickson has observed, Israel responded to U.S. diplomatic pressure by openly declaring its intention to deploy the Israel lobby to go over the heads of the Truman administration. We are fortunate to be able to review State Department memoranda from this period, and of particular importance is a summary of a telegram from Mr. Mark Etheridge, dated May 27th. Its content is quite valuable and revealing. Israel has now put forth its full territorial demands upon the Arab states. While Israel makes no demands upon Lebanon at present, it would later like a portion of southeastern Lebanon. Israel desires to acquire from Egypt the Egyptian-occupied Gaza Strip, allotted to the Arabs under the Partition Resolution. Israel will make further demands upon Transjordan for territory. Israel will retain occupied areas such as Western Galilee and Jaffa, Lydda and Ramla, allotted to the Arabs under the Partition Plan. Israel will relinquish none of the Negev. Etheridge follows the Israeli demands with the United States position. This government has consistently supported the position that Israel should offer territorial compensation for any territorial acquisition which it expects to obtain beyond the boundaries allotted to Israel in the resolution of November 29, 1947. Additionally, this government has recently made representations to the Israeli government urging its agreement to repatriation of a substantial number of refugees. Our representations on these two questions have thus far met with no success with the Israeli government. Israeli officials have in fact informed our representatives in Palestine that they intend to bring about a change in the position of the United States government on the above points through means available to them in the United States. There are also indications that the Israelis are prepared to use the implied threat of force to obtain the additional territory that they desire in Palestine. With respect to refugees, the Commission has succeeded in persuading the Arabs to give up their previous insistence upon repatriation as a prerequisite to negotiations. The Commission has failed to obtain any concessions from the Israelis on a territorial settlement or the refugee question. It is now the considered opinion of Mr. Etheridge that there will exist no possibility of peace on any basis heretofore envisioned by the United States government unless Israel modifies its demands. Mr. Etheridge believes that such modification is unlikely. Failure of the Israelis to modify their present demands will inevitably aggravate Arab distrust of Israel and bring about renewed Arab charges that the United States remains passive no matter how unreasonable the demands of Israel. Under recommendations, the department believes that the time has come to make a basic decision concerning our attitude toward Israel. The United States has given generous support to the foundation of the Jewish state. We are convinced that there is no reason why the Jews and the Arabs cannot live together in peace in the Near East. The department considers that it is now essential to inform the Israeli government forcefully that if it continues to reject the friendly advice which this government has offered solely in the interest of a genuine peace in the Near East, this government will be forced, with regret, to revise its attitude toward Israel, which may include withholding approval of the $49 million as yet unallocated of the $100 million earmarked by the Export-Import Bank for loan to Israel. There is also, of course, mention of the challenges with holding the Israelis accountable. The proposed course of action would arouse strong opposition in American Jewish circles. The significance of this document, I'm sure, is not lost on you. This was a top-secret memo, obviously not to be seen by the public, containing a plain stating of U.S. interests, which included a solution to the refugee problem. It also states Israel, far from being satisfied with their 77% of Palestine, and contrary to any pretense of concessions of any land, wanted to expand further. Truman, if it can be believed, took the State Department's advice with regard to suspending the $49 million of the export-import loan. Walter L. Hickson notes that this only amounted to posturing. As a result of stepped-up pressure from the lobby, Truman's anger proved short-lived. Bowing to telephone calls, telegrams, and public criticism, the president restored the funding, and the administration gave up on attempting to force the Israelis into making a settlement or accommodating return of Palestinian refugees. Truman's fundamentalist Christian upbringing and his sympathies regarding the persecution of Jews were reportedly sincere motivations for his Middle East policy. These factors duly considered, it appears that Truman struggled to maintain a balance of U.S. interests and Israeli interests, far from one and the same. I've covered the emergence of the American Zionist Council in a previous video. The AZC would replace the American Zionist Emergency Council in 1949. The new organization informed Isaiah Cy Kennan on February 12, 1951, that they'd agreed to retain you as its public relations counsel to assume the general direction of all its activities in connection with securing U.S. economic assistance for the State of Israel. In an address to the AZC's successor in April of 1975, Abba Eban, the prolific Israeli statesman, recalled, "In 1951, I asked Cy Kennan to come to Washington to ensure a permanent atmosphere of sympathy for Israel in the Congress and the press." Truman's successor, General of the Army Dwight Eisenhower, would provide the first serious obstacle to the lobby achieving their demands. Eisenhower was, of course, a monumental figure of the military establishment, which gave careful consideration to the Middle East, especially due to their proximity to the Soviet Union and their oil. Perhaps no document is more characteristic of the split between the Zionists and the Eisenhower administration than the 1953 National Intelligence Estimate. With decades of hindsight, and how much the situation has degraded in that time, this now reads as an extraordinarily honest assessment from a sitting U.S. president and his administration. In a section titled Obstacles to U.S. Influence in the Middle East, U.S. association with Israel is a continuing irritant in U.S.-Arab relations and the major obstacle to the acceptance of U.S. influence in the Middle East. The Arab world is united in its belief that the U.S. is primarily responsible for the establishment of Israel, which it interprets as an act of ruthless anti-Arab imperialism. Moreover, many Arabs believe that U.S. partiality in the Arab-Israeli dispute is further demonstrated by U.S. failure to press more vigorously for enforcement of UN decisions on Arab refugees, on delimitation of the borders of Israel, and on the internationalization of Jerusalem. The U.S. faces the dilemma that Israel cannot survive without foreign aid, and that U.S. aid to Israel deepens Arab resentment against the U.S. The National Intelligence Estimate also concludes the Arab-Israeli dispute has seriously damaged the U.S. security position in the Middle East. In a frank discussion on Zionism, Israel has an importance out of proportion to its size, population, and resources because A, it is one of the key factors in the current instability in the Arab states, and B, it has the political and financial support of the Zionist movement and of many influential groups and persons in the Western nations, particularly the U.S. The National Intelligence Estimate was further concerned with the renewal of hostilities between the warring parties to the 1948 war. The Israeli free fire policy mentioned earlier was cause for concern in this regard. While some 200 Zionist settlers died from attacks by Arab infiltrators between 1949 and 1956, in that same period, Zionist forces killed as many as 5,000 Arabs. One incident, the massacre at Kibbia, exemplifies the indiscriminate murders of the period. Using an attack which killed an Israeli mother and her 2 children as a pretext, Colonel Ariel Sharon's Commando Unit 101 rampaged through Kibbia, blowing up house by house and killing 69 people, most of them women and children. A telegram from Charge d'Affaires at U.S. Embassy Amman, Talcott Sealy, explains Jordan's outrage. The Israelis began by shelling village with mortar and artillery fire for between 3 and 4 hours. Demolition parties then entered village, blew up 39 houses, looted shops. An Israeli attack of this magnitude could have come at no worse time. It occurs just prior to arrival of important U.S. mission to area and caps 3 other recent unprovoked unilateral Israeli moves. If there existed before remote hope of persuading Jordan to sit down with Israel to discuss mutual water development problems and internationalization of Jerusalem, such a hope has been dashed to smithereens, at least for the foreseeable future. A blow to U.S. interests, since Jordan, according to the CIA, had been a key strategic ally in the region. Indeed, commenting on the assassination of King Abdullah, CIA wrote, "The death of Abdullah removes a resolute anti-communist, pro-Western ruler." In fact, so detrimental to U.S. foreign policy was Zionism that the CIA illegally organized and funded an anti-Zionist lobby in order to counter the Israel lobby, an operation overseen by CIA Director Allen Dulles. The American Friends of the Middle East was launched in 1951. The AFME, being a stateside outfit, made it explicitly illegal for the CIA to fund it under the National Security Act of 1947. As explained by Walter L. Hickson, Israeli aggressiveness heightened popular resentment across the Middle East, destabilizing the region, thus prompting the covert support for AFME and other groups. The failure of warnings and efforts from the military, Department of State, CIA, and FBI lends credence to the effectiveness of fostering friendly relations with members of Congress. David Ben-Gurion's brief hiatus as prime minister saw his seat filled by his right hand, Moshe Sharett. Sharet's insubordinate defense minister was none other than Pinhas Lavon. A failed operation named Susanna, an affair now notorious and bearing his name, saw Zionist operatives plant bombs in various Western targets, including British and American cinemas, libraries, civilian targets, as part of a false flag operation to be blamed on the Muslim Brotherhood to destabilize the Nasser regime. The operation was exposed and 13 operatives were arrested. 2 were executed. Ben-Gurion returned to government in February of 1955, initially as Minister of Defense. Just days later, or 1 week to be exact, the Israeli army launched Operation Black Arrow, a deadly cross-border raid into Egyptian-held Gaza, killing some 40 of their soldiers. Again occurring at an inopportune moment since, the month earlier, the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern, South Asian, and African Affairs had prepared a memo containing suggested main points of approach toward Israel-Arab settlement, which read, "While the basic obstacles to Israel-Arab peace still exist, there are a number of reasons for believing that special efforts to induce the parties to take steps toward a settlement of their major differences might bear fruit. These include an improvement during the past 2 years in the attitude of important segments of the Arab world toward the West and particularly toward the United States, and the promises of the Egyptian government to take steps toward a settlement with Israel." A shame the Black Arrow operation would commence, since they themselves acknowledged that Egypt was willing to, it's worth repeating, take steps toward a settlement with Israel. As fate would have it, it was this raid into Gaza that Nasser cited specifically as the driving force behind his signing an arms deal with Soviet-allied Czechoslovakia in September of 1955. Exactly what the Department of State had wanted to avoid. Now Egypt would receive MiG fighter jets, tanks, and armored personnel carriers from the Soviet bloc. Nasser, taking further steps toward sovereignty and independence from British control, nationalized the Suez Canal Company in July of the following year, in what would become a legendary move, as was his right under international law, considering the compensation Nasser pledged to pay. Britain sought war, along with France, who would offer weapons to the Israelis for their assistance, as well as building them a nuclear reactor. A war was starkly against U.S. interests, as they responded to the escalation by halting a shipment of helicopters, half-tracks, and machine guns to Israel. Deploying their signature strategy, the American Zionist Council produced a letter to be dispersed to members of Congress asking for arms to Israel and for releasing the weapons. For every member of Congress who signed the letter, the AZC advised local chapters to send congratulatory messages, and for those that didn't, please wire or write him. By August, Cy Kennan was elated that the 8-week campaign involving congressional and community leaders all over the country produced 151 signatures to the letter. That same month, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles caved to the pressure, giving Israel their weapons to do with as they pleased, despite all that was on the line. The ensuing Suez Crisis, as it's now known, in which Israel captured Gaza and the entire Sinai Peninsula up to the Suez Canal, with the assistance of France and Britain, enraged Eisenhower. The prospect of the Soviet Union sending troops to aid its newfound ally was an unwelcome one indeed. "Nothing justifies double-crossing us," said the president. Flexing his position as the world superpower by a long shot, Eisenhower came down on Britain and France to accept a ceasefire. Typical of the Israelis, they proved unwilling to relinquish their spoils. However, Eisenhower forced Israel to withdraw, via threats of cutting off aid and diplomatic support. The president apparently can pick up the phone and stop them if they want. John Foster Dulles told his Israeli counterpart, Golda Meir, the United States had hoped that common long-term policies could be worked out with Israel so that we could align ourselves effectively. We had not found them. Israel needed good relations with the Arabs to assure its future. What Israel had done in Egypt had deferred this possibility for perhaps a generation. The secretary could not see where Israel's present course could bring about any solution to Israel's problems. The security situation in the Middle East was far from satisfactory to the military establishment, who made as much known in a memorandum dated December 4, 1957, to the Secretary of Defense. Listen carefully. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are greatly concerned by the unsatisfactory politico-military situation in the Middle East, which they consider stems basically from the unresolved Arab-Israeli problem, and which poses a serious threat to the security of the United States and the free world. All three basic elements of the overall problem must be resolved. The present boundaries of Israel must be fixed and agreed upon. There must be a Western guarantee that Israel will not thereafter expand territorially, and the refugee problem must be settled. The United States should take this action now. The threat to U.S. security inherent in failing to take the initiative in solving this problem is so great as to transcend the interests of any minority group within the United States. If there was one decade in particular that saw the Israel lobby grow to its full potential, from which it remains largely unchanged to this day, it was the decade of the 1960s. Much of this happening during, and indeed as a consequence of, the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Much like David Niles worked behind the scenes in the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, the backstairs boy as he was called, inside Kennedy's White House lurked another highly competent liaison. As Walter L. Hickson describes Mike Feldman, a deputy special counsel to the president, Feldman functioned essentially as a member of the Israel lobby inside the White House. His influence on U.S. policy is made known in a May 1963 memo from Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs James Grant to Secretary of State Dean Rusk. In recent weeks, as you are aware, it has become increasingly clear that the White House is under steadily mounting domestic political pressure to adopt a foreign policy in the Near East more consonant with Israeli desires. Mike Feldman increasingly is the primary White House staff influence on United States policy with respect to Israel and Arab-Israeli issues. All outgoing cables and actions dealing with Israel and Arab-Israeli matters must now be cleared with the White House. Feldman assumed the difficult role of fashioning U.S. policies in compliance with Israeli interests in light of their opposing interests. One example being Israel's aggression towards Syria. In the words of Israeli historian Avi Schleim in his indispensable The Iron Wall, Israel's strategy of escalation on the Syrian front was the single most important factor in dragging the Middle East to war in June 1967. Amazingly, the United States voted with the Soviet Union in a resolution that deplored the hostile exchanges between Syria and Israel starting on March 8, 1962, and determined that the Israeli attack on March 16th and 17th, 1962, constituted a flagrant violation of the General Armistice Agreement. The resolution called upon Israel scrupulously to refrain from such action in the future. An oral history interview with Robert Comer from the JFK Presidential Library begins by describing him as a senior staff member of the National Security Council from 1961 through 1965. In this interview, Comer discusses working with McGeorge Bundy and the inner circle of the Bundy State Department. You'll doubtless find his frank discussion of the Israel lobby to be enlightening. It's certainly something to be studied closely and pondered. The interviewer asks, one hears the charge that the State Department, that Near Eastern Affairs, is pro-Arab. Is there justification for that? Comer responds, yes. State is naturally cast in the role as a deliberate, understandable counter to the great domestic pressures from the Israeli constituency on the White House. The Secretary of State is by definition, it's in his tacit job description, the spokesman for the even-handed policy against all that political advice that is going to the White House on how to be pro-Israeli. Second, American business, insofar as it has any influence, the oil companies, etc., tends to be pro-Arab. Third, in terms of strategic geography, Israel is a millstone around our necks and known as such to all and sundry. If it weren't that Israel were inhabited by Israelis, our policy would be totally different. You can make a very good case that it has been our commitments to Israel that has given the Russians great opportunities in the Middle East. Naturally, the State and Defense Departments at the professional level were Arabists. Our strategic and economic interests were emphatically with the Arabs. Only our political interest was with the Israelis, and our political interest was being argued by somebody else. So I regarded it as 1000% legitimate that state and defense, the professionals, tend to be pro-Arab. Comer describes tussling with the lobby. Quite naturally, the Bundy State Department Middle Easterner is cast in the role of being the debater with Mike Feldman or Larry O'Brien. Why? He's got to keep Jack Javits and a whole series of other guys happy on the Hill, and rightly so. Kennedy would soon learn in his brief tenure what it meant to be at odds with the lobby. A number of fateful policies he pursued, measures intended to appease the Israelis and to make them receptive to U.S. demands, proved a spectacular gamble that failed. Kennedy would forever alter the relationship between Israel and the United States by breaking the barrier on direct advanced weapons shipments to Israel. Sending them Hawk missiles was a two-pronged strategy. Kennedy hoped to settle the refugee question, namely by getting Israel to agree to take in even a small number of refugees. Additionally, by providing conventional weapons to the Jewish state, Kennedy hoped that Israel would not pursue nuclear weapons. The U.S. position was unequivocal. No nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. As you all know, the Israelis defied Kennedy on both. From his thank you note to the president, David Ben-Gurion, dated August 20th, 1962, wrote, I would like to take the opportunity to express to you my profound appreciation for your decision to issue instructions that the Hawk missiles be supplied to Israel. Regarding the settlement of the refugee crisis in exchange, however, those steps will prove ineffectual and will result only in complicating matters even more for us without any advantage accruing to the refugees themselves. After all, says Ben-Gurion, these Arab refugees left their former place of domicile at the call of the Arab leaders. A reference to the foundational Israeli myth, disproven by CIA records as early as the late 1950s, that Arab broadcasts instructed the Palestinians to leave their homes before the Arab army's invasion. In reality, even the unearthed Israeli records prove otherwise, as has been documented by historians including Benny Morris, that the Haganah intelligence service was reporting every Arab leaving the country is regarded as a traitor and would be put on trial in Syria. Everyone wishing to leave the country had to obtain permission from the Arab National Committee in Haifa. Driving the point home further, on September 17th, David Ben-Gurion instructed his ambassador in Washington, I find it necessary to write to you so that you can pass on a translation of this letter to our friends. We will not receive any additional Arab refugees. Obviously, this plan will not be implemented. If necessary, we shall fight against it to the last man. With regard to the Israeli nuclear program, well, in December 1962, in Palm Beach, Florida, the president met with Foreign Minister Golda Meir. Kennedy told her, from the memorandum of conversation, we are opposed to nuclear proliferation. Mrs. Meyer reassured the president that there would not be any difficulty between us on the Israeli nuclear reactor in Dimona. Interestingly, she also said, Israel is perfectly prepared to live within its present borders. It doesn't want more land. Despite her assurances, Israel developed an arsenal of nuclear weapons that, by the time Meyer herself became prime minister, became a small arsenal of over a dozen devices. To create their first nuclear weapons, Israel stole hundreds of pounds of highly enriched uranium in a years-long espionage operation orchestrated by LACOM, the Israelis' secret scientific intelligence agency. The source of the uranium was a facility owned by the Numek Corporation in Apollo, Pennsylvania. Not only did the Israelis lie about developing a nuclear reactor and about developing weapons, they further stole uranium to be used for nuclear weapons that they've never disclosed. Israel had proven itself to be a rogue state, characterized by political intransigence and routine aggression against its neighbors. To make matters worse, their pursuit of nuclear weapons threatened to further destabilize the region to the point of no return, and still does, by the way. This being in stark contrast to its western neighbor, who had, even after the wars of attrition and the Israeli invasion of the Sinai Peninsula, sought peace with Israel. A memo authored by esteemed statesman John J. McCloy features his account of a meeting with Gamal Abdel Nasser in Cairo in June 1963, along with American Ambassador John Beidou. I met with Nasser at 7 p.m. Thursday and spent 2 hours with him. He suggested that perhaps it could be arranged that in response to a written inquiry by the president regarding his intentions, he could give a written reply. Number one, he had no intention whatsoever of engaging in nuclear weapons, and number two, he had no intention of attacking Israel. He narrated a full history of Israeli attacks beginning in 1952 through 1956, his request for weapons, the refusal of Britain, France, and the U.S. to give him weapons after these attacks, and his final appeal to the Russians. He repeated several times that I could report to the president that he had no intent or desire to manufacture nuclear material and he had no intention of attacking Israel. Having devoted attention to the Truman administration, it would appear that Lyndon Baines Johnson has a lot in common with his Democratic forebear. Johnson, also being a fundamentalist, his aunt Jessie Hatcher remained throughout his life a source of influence on his beliefs. Lyndon, always remember this, she reportedly told him. Don't ever go against Israel, because Israel was given to them by God. The Jews are God's people, and they are always going to be. That's their land, and nobody is going to take it away from them. As with Truman, however, this infatuation with the Bible and its perceived impact on real Middle East policy only went so far. And as with Truman, Johnson struggled quite powerfully with the opposing interests of the United States and Israel, far from one and the same. Johnson, of course, immediately inherited Kennedy's cabinet following his death. In a meeting with his Israeli counterpart, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, in June of 1964, the president said that as long as he remained in the White House, Mr. Feldman would continue to serve as his prime minister on the question of Israel. Johnson practically gave in completely at certain points during his presidency to the lobby. Walter L. Hickson notes the extremes to which this amounted. Showing both fear of the lobby's political clout as well as frustration with its tactics, Johnson made the extraordinary statement that he would simply leave up to the Israelis and the lobby the decision on U.S. arms sales to Jordan.
My judgment is, and it's Rusk's judgment, that this little king has some value to us, and that we ought to keep him as far away from the Soviet and Nasser as we can. The Israelis, though, don't think so. Well, if they don't, we'll just pull out. We won't sell him a damn thing. But we want it to be clear it's their decision. And we want to be clear that we're doing it so we can satisfy the Jews and not irritate them. Our people, the Jews in our country, say that we ought not to, under any circumstances, sell Jordan anything. Now, that we've spent $600 million on this course of action under Kennedy and all through the years. Only reason I'm helping Jordan is on account of Israel. Now, if Israel considers them their enemy and not of help, then we just wasted $600 million. But I'm not prepared to take on the New York Times and Mike Feldman and everybody else. And I'm going to let them make the decision.
The lobby's pressure, despite Johnson's extraordinary friendliness with the Israelis, reached such great heights that he told now Foreign Minister Abba Eban in February 1966, "We always seem to have a problem with well-meaning friends of Israel who attempted to help our relations along." He asked Eban to tell them to stop coming in the back door, or writing, or sending telegrams, or talking to the newspapers. As sympathetic as Johnson was to the Israelis, and as much as his Bible-thumping contributed to this worldview, he still had to consider U.S. positions and interests, which were starkly opposed to Israeli interests. While Kennedy selling Hawk missiles was one thing, those were defensive weapons. But directly sending offensive weapons was something the U.S. government wanted to avoid since, basically, they were worried about what the Israelis would do with them. From a conversation with Dean Rusk,
"I think there's some difficulty about our making a flat commitment on the numbers of tanks when we're on notice that, so far as we can tell now, that they're going to take preemptive action on that Jordan water business."
Mm-hmm.
President John F. Kennedy's Department of Justice, led by brother Bobby Kennedy, ordered the American Zionist Council in December of 1962 to register as a foreign agent. Their receiving funds from the American section of the Jewish Agency for Israel constituted the council an agent of a foreign principal, and the council's registration was requested. In January of the new year, Cy Kennan incorporates the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. In a clever maneuver to avoid registering as a foreign agent themselves, the lobbying arm of the AZC broke off into its own outfit, despite receiving the same funding and pursuing the same goals to this day. AIPAC now led the effort to obtain these offensive weapons while Johnson was in the White House. In what would become their standard procedure, they deployed a letter to Secretary of State Dean Rusk, securing signatures from 76 House members. By July of 1965, the United States and Israel signed a deal providing 210 M48 Patton tanks. They further demanded planes, so much so that, wrote Comer to President Johnson, "I got Eban down here on the 12th and McNamara dusted him off in 20 no-nonsense minutes. Our tactic of sicking McNamara on the Israelis seems to have worked. We'll sell Israel 48 A4Es, about $50 million, and they will undertake in return to, number one, quietly support our sale of 36 secondhand F-104s to Jordan, and number two, reaffirm their promises not to go nuclear." Of course, by this time, regulators for the Atomic Energy Commission had discovered hundreds of pounds of highly enriched uranium missing from the NUMEC plant at Apollo. As reported by Howard Cohn and Barbara Newman for Rolling Stone in December 1977, the total missing and unaccounted for was 194 pounds, larger by far than any previous known discrepancy at other U.S. nuclear facilities. Approximately 22 pounds of enriched uranium are needed to make the smallest functional bomb. The number grew substantially. By early 1967, the Atomic Energy Commission had re-inventoried the plant and found, unaccounted for, 572 pounds in all. In 1976, CIA Deputy Director for Science and Technology Carl E. Duckett briefed members of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Victor Galinsky was one of them. What Duckett confirmed, to everyone's astonishment, was that the CIA believed that the nuclear explosives in Israel's first several bombs, about 100 kilograms of bomb-grade uranium in all, came from material that was missing at a U.S. naval nuclear fuel plant operated by the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation in Apollo, Pennsylvania. It was reasonable for Dean Rusk to assume that Israel intends to make its decisions on whether to produce nuclear weapons without consulting us. By contrast, Dean Rusk was thrilled with Egypt for not pursuing nuclear weapons, since the United States was utterly opposed to the introduction of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Rusk would have a tense confrontation with the Israeli ambassador Gideon Raphael. Would Israel agree to International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards, he asked. Ambassador Raphael said Israel was not giving any thought to it. Rusk insisted that if Israel went nuclear, you will lose U.S. support. If, on the other hand, you accepted a nuclear ban, Your neighbors would follow you, and that would be a first step toward reduction of tensions. This consideration is fundamental to the U.S. position. Either this card is in your deck, or it is not. If it's not, then get it out of the way by accepting safeguards. Rusk again noted that if Israel is holding open the nuclear option, it should forget U.S. support. We would not be with you. On the road to the 1967 war, a telegram from U.S. Embassy Tel Aviv, back to U.S. state, expresses strong disapproval over the Israeli attack on Syrian tractors on May 13th. If such actions lead to Security Council considerations, the U.S. will not be able to support Israel. Years later, in 1976, Moshe Dayan would tell reporter Rami Tal how at least 80% of the clashes there started, while he was defense minister. Speaking of the Syrian front, in my opinion, more than 80%. We would send a tractor to plow someplace in the demilitarized area and knew in advance that the Syrians would start to shoot. If they didn't shoot, we would tell the tractor to advance farther until in the end the Syrians would get annoyed and shoot. And then we would use artillery and later the Air Force. The Americans were perplexed with why, if the Israelis were militarily superior to all the Arab states, did they bother attacking them this way? In a July 1965 telegram from the Department of State to the embassy in Israel, we would have expected, during recent months as high tide of Arab summit solidarity receded and as Arab realists recognized once again Israel's basic military preeminence, the government of Israel's actions would be characterized more consistently by calm, confidence, and restraint expected of a nation whose security is essentially, if not absolutely, assured. The government of Israel's actions pointed to above also have disadvantages in our view of detracting from Israel's image as a country sincerely devoted to peace with its neighbors and of making U.S. government efforts to help Israel more difficult and reducing their chances of success. Their perplexity turned to outrage as news emerged of an Israeli raid on Samu in the West Bank on November 13, 1966. In response to the deaths of 3 Israeli soldiers from landmines, the Israelis sent in a large invasion force including tanks and followed by aircraft. In an act of collective punishment, the IDF forced everyone into the town square to watch as they demolished their houses, some 125 in all. The CIA offered a sobering assessment of the damage the raid caused. King Hussein had made a sustained effort to avoid provocations to Israel. This has involved such steps as preventing Arab saboteurs from crossing from Jordan into Israel and keeping his armored forces east of the Jordan River. These measures have been politically unpopular at home and have subjected him to criticism from other Arab states. The recent raid involved an infantry brigade supported by armor, aircraft, and artillery. It resulted in about 50 deaths, half of them Jordanian soldiers, and in the destruction of about 150 buildings. He is aware that retaliation carries the risk of an expanded conflict, which could involve the bulk of his army, a process in which the latter would almost certainly be defeated. The Israeli raid seems illogical and miscalculated to us. Walt Rostow, National Security Advisor, as well opined, retaliation is not the point in this case. This 3,000-man raid with tanks and planes was out of all proportion to the provocation and was aimed at the wrong target. In hitting Jordan so hard, the Israelis have done a great deal of damage to our interests and to their own. They've wrecked a good system of tacit cooperation between Hussein and the Israelis. Continuing this kind of cooperation will be all but impossible now, which stung for the U.S. even more when considering we've spent $500 million to shore him up. We might begin putting out the line with our Jewish friends here that the U.S. can't go on supporting Israel's interests in the Middle East unless the Israelis themselves show some intent over the long run to reach an accommodation with the Arabs. Washington responded to the Samu incident by speeding up delivery of F-104 aircraft to Jordan. Rostow acknowledged that, no matter what we do, the Israelis and their friends will object. But we're just cleaning up the mess that Israel's raid created, and we've taken Israel's military concerns into account. By contrast, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in a February 1967 memorandum to Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, made their feelings known with regard to arming Israel. The Joint Chiefs of Staff do not consider that military aid to Israel is justified by the internal or external threat. Israel's present military forces are capable of defending successfully against any individual or collective Arab attack. However, the previously bitter Rostow changed his tune, telling Johnson, "Their December raid on Samu precipitated our emergency military assistance to Jordan, costing us about $9 million. While we made no commitment to match exactly for Israel what their action at Samu forced us to in Jordan, Ambassador to the United Nations Arthur Goldberg, under continuing pressure in New York, feels strongly we should do nearly that." Pressure from New York, a euphemism for the lobby. You may also find it interesting that the Israelis considered Goldberg an asset and even referred to him by a code name, Menashe. In April of 1967, the Israelis again launched a provocative assault on Syria, sending tractors as was routine, and following Syrian shelling, the Israelis launched an assault deep into Syrian territory, shooting down 6 MiG fighter aircraft, including 2 in Damascus. Judging from briefing notes for CIA Director Richard Helms, this left Nasser little choice. The Egyptians, embarrassed because they had not helped the Syrians in April, then made a big show of marching into Sinai, partly to show good faith, partly in hopes of deterring the Israelis. Nasser followed this with a move which would seal the fate of the Middle East forever, closing the Strait of Tiran. Eager to avoid a repeat of Eisenhower's strong disapproval of the Suez invasion of 1956, the lobby utilized all means at their disposal. The Israeli Foreign Ministry orchestrated a campaign to, quote, "create a public atmosphere that will constitute pressure on the administration in the direction of obtaining our desired goals, without it being explicitly clear that we are behind this public campaign." On May 26, 1967, Foreign Minister Abba Eban met secretly with President Johnson to lay out a fake apocalyptic scenario in which we are sitting on a time bomb, saying they faced imminent attack. In January 1969, the State Department's Historical Studies Division produced a report, at the time top secret, on United States policy and diplomacy in the Middle East crisis from May 15th to June 10th, 1967. It contains the U.S. government's position on the threat of an Egyptian attack on Israel. Since Eban had wondered why the United States did not accept Israeli intelligence reports of a possible imminent United Arab Republic attack on Israel, Secretary McNamara explained to Eban in some detail that 3 separate intelligence groups had looked carefully into the matter, and that it was the U.S. conclusion that the Egyptian deployments were defensive. All estimates were unanimous, President Johnson added, that if the United Arab Republic attacked, Israel would, quote, "whip the hell out of them." Johnson additionally sent a telegram to Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. "The Soviets tell me that they have information that you are preparing to take military action against your Arab neighbors and provoke a conflict which would be fraught with great consequences. They tell us that they know the Arabs do not wish a military conflict. Israel just must not take any preemptive military action and thereby make itself responsible for the initiation of hostilities. Unilateral action on the part of Israel would be irresponsible and catastrophic." Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Avraham Harman told Dean Rusk, in a conversation just days before the war began, that Israel is threatened not with aggression, but with genocide. Dean Rusk responded, just days after Harman's boss was told the same by President Johnson, that we have been told categorically that Egypt will not attack. They had good reason to believe this since, to read from a State Department telegram from May 27th, on behalf of all Arab ambassadors, Lebanese, Kuwaiti, and Libyan ambassadors called on the Secretary May 27th on instructions that their governments express concern of Arab countries about present Arab-Israeli crisis. Ambassadors emphasized that no Arab state wanted to start war and no one wanted unfriendly relations with the U.S. I've covered the Israeli admissions that Nasser did not want a war prior to June 5, 1967, but just to review, no less an Israeli figure than Yitzhak Rabin, then Chief of Staff of the IDF, said in 1968 that the 2 divisions that Nasser sent to Sinai on May 14th would not have been enough to unleash an offensive against Israel. He knew it, and we knew it. His deputy, Ezra Weitzman, further said there was never a danger of extermination. Years later, in 1982, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin declared, "We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him." Aware of the unfortunate position an Israeli attack on Egypt would put the United States, the Israelis decided to lie about it. Harry McPherson, then White House counsel, provides an amusing account of Israeli lying following their preemptive attack on Egypt. The first day of the war, June 5th, McPherson made his way over to the Israeli Defense Ministry and met with Abba Eban. Something quickly struck him as odd. They were saying that they were hit by the Egyptians, were attacked by the Egyptians, and they had counterattacked. It didn't seem right to me, and I kept asking about this. I kept saying, "Well, where did they hit you?" And he said, "Oh, there were big movements down in the Sinai, in the Negev." I said, "Into Israel?" And he said, "It was imminent. It was coming." I said, but did they cross over? It's vital for the president to know. Is he going to be talking on behalf of a country that was literally attacked or a country that launched a preventive attack? And he said, "They were right there." At that time, the air raid siren went off again, and he kept talking. And he didn't make a move. Nobody made a move to go underground. Finally, one of them said, "Shouldn't we go underground?" And General Yariv looked at his watch and thought for a minute and said, "No, that won't be necessary." And suddenly, the whole thing just broke open. Of course it wasn't necessary. There weren't any damned Arab airplanes left. It was easy enough to tell by the first day, as was noted by the CIA. An analysis of presently available information suggests that Israel fired the first shots today. Walt Rostow, remembering a cabinet meeting from that day with Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, Clark Clifford, and Dean Acheson, the former Secretary of State under Harry Truman, wrote, "There was an interesting moment, as I remember it. Mr. Acheson looked back on the whole history of Israeli independence and, in effect, said that it was a mistake to ever create the State of Israel." In a 1983 oral history interview with the aforementioned UN Ambassador Arthur Goldberg, the asset known to the Israelis by his codename Menashe, claimed, "I had made up my mind in 1967 that I was going to resign. But the Middle East War broke out, and Rusk disqualified himself since he had been an assistant secretary of state and made some anti-Israel statements. The president thereupon asked me to take charge. So the State Department did not handle the 1967 war. I handled it. Of course, I advised them, I advised the White House, but I dealt primarily with the president." Interesting, Rusk was deemed biased when, as observed by Walter L. Hickson, speaking at an AIPAC dinner celebrating Israel's 17th anniversary in 1965, Goldberg declared he believed in, quote, "the truth of the Old Testament prophecy that God selected Eretz Israel to be his holy land." After leaving the administration in 1968, Goldberg was named president of the American Jewish Committee. In 1972, Goldberg became honorary president of Neot Kedumim, the Gardens of Israel, a project centered on recreation of the biblical landscape of ancient Israel in an area between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. This man had a central role in U.S. policy toward the territories captured by Israel in 1967. The lobby's wrath was felt like it hadn't ever been before when State Department spokesman Robert J. McCluskey made the mistake of declaring on June 5th, the first day of the war, "We have tried to steer an even-handed course through this. Our position is neutral in thought, word, and deed." McGeorge Bundy himself, in an oral history interview of his own, frankly contextualized the backlash Johnson swiftly received for his daring statement. The president was driven up the wall in a lower-key sense of importance by a State Department announcement that we were neutral in thought and deed and word, which is not what his friends in New York wanted to hear. So he heard about that from the Arthur Krims and the Abe Feinbergs of the world. AIPAC, at its zenith, achieved a veritable public relations blitz, amounting to a full-blown assault on the White House. As summarized by Dixon Donnelly, the State Department's Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, In a communication to Secretary Dean Rusk, during the period of June 9th to the 12th, we processed some 9,000 pieces of public mail commenting on the Middle East crisis. About 98% of the mail was pro-Israeli, with, quote, only a handful of writers supporting the Arab states. The White House received an additional 120,000 letters, which will all be answered. Cy Kennan once summarized AIPAC's modus operandi this way. I put it very succinctly in one sentence. We appeal to local leadership to write or telegraph or telephone their congressmen and urge them to call upon the president to overrule the Department of State. And this has been going on now for some 20 years. Johnson, the Bible thumper and committed Zionist, was nonetheless feeling the pressure. On June 7th, the domestic advisors named Larry Levinson and Ben Wattenberg told the president, "We talked to David Brody of the Anti-Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith, and he reported this reaction from the Jewish community in America. There was sharp disillusion and dismay at the McCluskey statement concerning neutrality in word, thought, and deed. American Jews are looking to the president for assurances of a real, guaranteed, meaningful peace in the Middle East, and that Israel not be forced to roll back as they were by the Dulles Eisenhower position in 1956. Johnson snapped. He told Levinson, "You Zionist dupe. You and Wattenberg are Zionist dupes in the White House. Why can't you see I'm doing all I can for Israel?" Johnson's displeasure would hardly end there. One need only consider the events of the 8th of June. As war seemed inevitable, on May 23, 1967, NSA Director General Marshall Carter communicated via telegram to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, "The present situation in the Middle East has resulted in NSA declaring a SIGINT readiness. In order to augment coverage in the area, the diversion of the USS Liberty is considered a necessary course of action in view of the Liberty's excellent collection, processing, and reporting capabilities, and her ability to remain on station for extended periods." The ship, armed with only 4 50-caliber machine guns and an infirmary with a capacity of 4 patients for almost 300 men, was anything but a battleship. Further, its unusual mast antenna configuration gave away the ship's spy capabilities to the point that they had been surveilled off the coast of Southwest Africa on 2 separate deployments. There's also the fact that, according to an official Israeli inquiry, an observer aboard an Israeli spy plane had identified the ship as the U.S. Navy ship Liberty, just one of some 8 reconnaissance flights over the Liberty through the morning and into the afternoon. Despite no nation ever having attacked a spy ship, the Liberty was the target of an hour-long attack, including strafing from jets, napalm, and later torpedo boats who launched a torpedo into the ship's hull, all in all, killing 34 sailors. The ship's captain, William McGonigal, reported to the official U.S. Navy Court of Inquiry, "When the boats reached an approximate range of 2,000 yards, it appeared that they were flying an Israeli flag." This was later verified. Secretary of State Dean Rusk minced no words in his stinging rebuke to the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. At the time of the attack, the USS Liberty was flying the American flag, and its identification was clearly indicated in large white letters and numerals on its hull. It was broad daylight, and the weather conditions were excellent. Experience demonstrates that both the flag and the identification number of the vessel were readily visible from the air. At 2:50 local time on June 8, 1967, 2 Israeli aircraft circled the USS Liberty 3 times, with the evident purpose of identifying the vessel. Accordingly, there is every reason to believe that the USS Liberty was identified, or at least her nationality determined, by Israeli aircraft approximately 1 hour before the attack. In these circumstances, the later military attack by Israeli aircraft on the USS Liberty is quite literally incomprehensible. The silhouette and conduct of the USS Liberty readily distinguished it from any vessel that could have been considered as hostile. The USS Liberty was peacefully engaged, posed no threat whatsoever to the torpedo boats, and obviously carried no armament affording it combat capability. It could and should have been scrutinized visually at close range before torpedoes were fired. The Israelis responded by blaming the United States. The government of Israel regrets that it was not given prior information by the government of the United States of the presence of a United States vessel. It would be appreciated if the government of Israel could be given timely information of the approach by United States vessels to shores where the Israeli Defense Forces are in authority. The National Security Council called it a terrible note. The Naval Court of Inquiry was undertaken by Admiral Isaac Kidd Jr. with Chief Counsel Ward Boston. They concluded the attack was a case of mistaken identity. However, years later, Boston admitted in a sworn affidavit President Lyndon Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered them to conclude that the attack was a case of mistaken identity despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. A damning conclusion he made during the investigation was that the evidence was clear. Both Admiral Kidd and I believed with certainty that this attack, which killed 34 American sailors and injured 172 others, was a deliberate effort to sink an American ship and murder its entire crew. The NSA director concurred. It couldn't be anything else but deliberate. As did in official CIA history, many informed Americans soon came to believe that the assault had been anything but accidental. CIA initially resisted this judgment, but the cumulative weight of the evidence rapidly undermined this position. Said then CIA Director Richard Helms himself, "I don't think that there can be any doubt that the Israelis knew exactly what they were doing." Following this attack, on June 14th, Apex Cy Kennan bragged that in Congress, just about everybody is voting in support of Israel's position. Walter L. Hickson unearthed an AP poll. An Associated Press poll found that 365 out of 438 responses from members of Congress were opposed to withdrawal from the territories captured by Israel without peace. Days later, despite the overwhelming evidence provided by virtually every individual in a position to know the details of the Liberty case, Johnson rewarded the Israelis with a speech that forever changed the previously held U.S. position of territorial integrity. And far from admonishing the Zionists for initiating hostilities, something they said would be irresponsible and catastrophic, Johnson declared that what the nations of the region needed was recognized boundaries and other arrangements that will give them security against terror, destruction, and war. In essence, no return to the previous border and no withdrawal from Israel's new territories, which now included the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and most consequentially, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. There are some who have urged, as a single, simple solution, an immediate return to the situation as it was on June 4th. As our distinguished and able ambassador, Mr. Arthur Goldberg, has already said, this is not a prescription for peace, but for renewed hostilities. Indeed, the Jewish community here would be up in arms if they switched their Middle East positions, Goldberg said. Johnson, the Christian fundamentalist, ardent Zionist, with everything he had done, supporting not only their crusade into the Arab world and changing U.S. policy to allow Israel to retain these territories indefinitely, all while overlooking the deliberate attempt to sink a U.S. Navy spy ship, Johnson, if it can be believed, was feeling the heat from the lobby well over a month after the war. From the Foreign Relations of the United States series, President Johnson held his regular weekly luncheon meeting on July 25, 1967, with Secretary Rusk, Secretary McNamara, and Walt Rostow. Notes of the meeting state that there was a discussion of the Middle East and that the president told Rostow to tell Bundy to channel future requests by leading Jewish leaders to Bundy and not to the president. The president said he was seeing too many. Johnson also rewarded the Israelis with a shipment of F-4 Phantoms, replacing France as Israel's principal arms supplier. The Foreign Relations of the United States series as well contains a memorandum dated November the 9th, 1968. On November 7th, Secretary Clifford and Secretary Rusk met with the president. Both secretaries argued with the president in favor of insisting on additional assurances from the Israelis on the grounds that nuclear weapons in the Middle East were extremely dangerous for the national security of the United States. The president apparently said that he had promised the F-4s without any conditions, and that was his position. He did not even wish to accept Mr. Rusk's position that we had at least to obtain the same assurances that we had previously received from the Israelis in connection with the A4 negotiations. This aid can hardly be justified on the grounds that Israel was a key strategic ally during the Cold War, as Henry Kissinger admitted flatly to a room full of lobbyists in 1975. Israeli strength does not prevent the spread of communism in the Arab world. Israeli strength provides for Israeli security. The best defense against the spread of communism in the Arab world is to strengthen the moderate Arab governments. So it is difficult to claim that a strong Israel serves American interests because it prevents the spread of communism in the Arab world. It does not. It provides for the survival of Israel. Before the end of the month of the June 1967 war, in the words of Israeli historian Ilan Pape, on the 19th of June, the full gathering of Israel's political leaders decided, without a single objection, to exclude the West Bank and the Gaza Strip from future negotiations. This position was clarified by Prime Minister Eshkol himself. He explained to ministers that when he talked to the press about an Israeli readiness to withdraw from territories in exchange for peace, "I did not mean the West Bank and the Gaza Strip," Eshkol reassured his ministers. The Israeli government had further secured the full backing of the United States. Israel maintained its policy of intransigence, and just as they refused to budge in 1948, their new possessions in 1967 created a deteriorating situation. In 1973, Egypt and Syria would launch a surprise attack to reclaim its properties. The humiliating deaths of some 2,000 Israeli troops forced Prime Minister Golda Meir into retirement. During the war, Israel deployed its nuclear weapons for use. The U.S. military readiness reached DEFCON 3, the highest possible during peacetime. The war changed the leverage of the Arab states, and eventually culminated in Israel ceding the Sinai Peninsula for peace with Egypt. But Israel refused to meet with Jordan, despite pressure from Henry Kissinger. The Israeli defense analyst Avner Yaniv, who was also professor of political science at the University of Haifa, recognizes this refusal as a turning point for Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin declined to meet with Jordan, giving the PLO a golden opportunity to cash in on its rising international status and gain recognition at the Rabat Conference of the Arab League on October 29, 1974, as the sole legitimate spokesman for the Palestinian cause. This important milestone in the history of the PLO gave it the boost it needed to gain the international prominence for which it had been struggling ever since 1967. The weight of the Arab bloc in the wider Islamic conference, especially at a moment when Arab oil power was at its all-time peak, ensured that this large group of nations would endorse the PLO as well. The Islamic conference, in turn, was large enough to sway opinion in favor of the PLO in the non-aligned bloc, too. This guaranteed the unequivocal support of both the Soviets and the Chinese, along with their European clients. Faced with such a conglomeration of forces, the Western European nations could no longer refuse to pay official attention to the PLO. And against this background, the PLO had no problem in obtaining the recognition of the United Nations, at least in the status of an observer. By the end of 1974, then, it was no longer as essential as it had been that the PLO resort to attacks against Israeli civilians for the purpose of attracting world attention. If Europe and the United States were to adopt the PLO thesis that the Palestinian issue could not be solved without the establishment of a Palestinian state, and that the only legitimate spokesman for the Palestinian cause was the PLO, Israel could have found itself under intolerable pressure to deal with the PLO, specifically to accept the principle that the PLO should be allowed to form an independent state on the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. But Israel, said Yitzhak Rabin in 1975, would never accept such a state. I repeat firmly, clearly, categorically, the Israeli Prime Minister concluded, such a state will not be created. The situation grew more intolerable under the Carter administration. His national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, had even written a paper in 1975 calling for a PLO state in the West Bank and Gaza. For the leaders of the ruling Labor government, the main unspoken purpose was to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state, from Golda Meir to Moshe Dayan to Yitzhak Rabin to Shimon Peres. Even President Ronald Reagan made a number of policy decisions that irked the Zionists. The swiftness with which the United States under Reagan turned to the orientation of the Carter administration was alarming to Israel. Increasingly, it appeared as if the United States was looking for ways of advancing Israeli-Egyptian autonomy talks through a combination of indirect pressure on Israel to slow down the settlement policy in the West Bank and a discreet wooing of the PLO. The Yom Kippur War had dealt a fatal blow to the Labor government, in power from Israel's creation to the 1977 elections. And the Likud, under the leadership of Menachem Begin, chose to deal with the increasingly moderate and respected PLO by invading Lebanon, where they had their headquarters. Aside from the massacres at Sabra and Shatila, in which Defense Minister Ariel Sharon declared that their Lebanese Christian auxiliaries would clean everything, the Israeli military also destroyed 500 buildings by the first week of July, and killed some 20,000 people.
علم الله أنه ما خطر في بالنا ضرب الأبراج ولكن بعدما طفح الكيل وشاهدنا ظلم وتعسف التحالف الأمريكي الإسرائيلي على أهلنا في فلسطين ولبنان تبادر إلى ذهني ذلك، وإن الأحداث التي أثرت في نفسي بشكل مباشر ترجع إلى عام 1982 وما تلاها من أحداث، عندما أذنت أمريكا للإسرائيليين باجتياح لبنان، وساعد في ذلك الأسطول الثالث الأمريكي. وفي تلك اللحظات العصيبة جاشت في نفسي معان كثيرة يصعب وصفها، ولكنها أنتجت شعورا عارما برفض الظلم، وولدت تصميما قويا على معاقبة الظالمين. وبينما أنا أنظر إلى تلك الأبراج المدمرة في لبنان انقدح في ذهني أن نعاقب الظالم بالمثل، وأن ندمر أبراجا في أمريكا لتذوق بعض ما ذقنا ولترتدع عن قتل أطفالنا ونسائنا.
An especially taboo topic is how the U.S.-Israel special relationship is inextricably linked with the U.S. so-called War on Terror. The groundwork had been laid years before September 11th when, in 1992, Paul Wolfowitz, then Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, supervised the drafting of the Defense Policy Guidance document, which called for using military force, if necessary, to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in such countries as North Korea, Iraq, some of the successor republics to the Soviet Union, and in Europe. An embarrassment for the first Bush administration when it was leaked, but under his son's administration, Wolfowitz became number 2 at the Pentagon, Deputy Secretary of Defense. When the Jerusalem Post named Wolfowitz Man of the Year in 2003, they explained their decision with, "The war in Iraq had many authors. What's not in dispute is that Wolfowitz is the principal author of the doctrine of preemption, which framed the war in Iraq and which, when it comes to it, will underpin U.S. action against other rogue states." When President Bush says, "America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons," that's Wolfowitz talking. The Post had earlier reported that, upon rumors of his appointment, pro-Israel communities are jumping for joy. Wolfowitz is considered a strong supporter of Israel. He has been one of the loudest proponents of a tough policy toward Iraq focused on finding a way to bring down Saddam Hussein's regime. Why the Israeli interest in Iraq? Philip Zelikow, a member of George W. Bush's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, explained in September of 2002, "Everybody says, show me an imminent threat from Iraq to America. Why would Iraq attack America or use nuclear weapons against us? So I'll tell you what I think the real threat is, and actually has been since 1990. It's the threat against Israel. And this is the threat that dare not speak its name because the Europeans don't care deeply about that threat. I will tell you frankly. and the American government doesn't want to lean too hard on it rhetorically because it's not a popular sell. Indeed, the New York Times didn't shy away from the suggestion when reporting just days after 9/11. Mr. Wolfowitz, the Pentagon's influential deputy secretary, is a conservative thinker who has continued to press for a military campaign against Iraq that would not only punish Mr. Hussein for his past support for terrorism at home and abroad, but would also eliminate the danger he poses to Israel and the West in his quest to acquire weapons of mass destruction. Afghanistan and subsequently Iraq were to be part of a
broad and sustained campaign.
Not to end there, Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, the same one who authorized the massacres at Sabra and Shatila, called on the international community to target Iran as soon as the imminent conflict with Iraq is complete.